Howdy, everyone. Sorry this is out so late. As you know, you have an upcoming test, so I wanted to just run you through the learning objectives that we've been talking about. As I mentioned, the best way to study for the exam is to think about it from the perspective of the learning objectives. Technically, everything on the syllabus up to this point, the 4 weeks particularly, I think is fair game for the exam. So your readings and your online quizzes and such. But realistically, it looks like since the exam is primarily multiple choice, you should probably focus primarily on what you learned in your learning objectives, what the concepts you covered in class, and to a lesser extent, some of the subsidiary stuff in recitations. But I assembled the learning objectives for you, and which you already probably should have been doing yourself anyway for your notes or your notebooks or whatever. But that's a different thing. Let's just sort of go through and talk about what we can. This is not a fancy or fun slideshow, just getting us through and talking through as much as we can before the test. So here's an overview of the first week's learning objectives. We'll sort of go one by one. Know the structure of the NSPE Code of Ethics and the content of its preamble. So remember that this is one of the things which you can just sort of look for in your textbook, I believe. Let me check. I have it right here. Yeah, so I think on 213 of your textbook, you can find the NSPE code. You can also find it online. Remember that it has a preamble, fundamental canons, rules of practice, and professional obligations. Those seem to be the three major sections, so just know that those are the sections. There will definitely be section or test questions on the NSPE. Sorry. So go ahead, make sure you know that. Understand what is meant by descriptive ethics, normative ethics, and meta ethics. Okay, so remember that descriptive ethics is just the description of people's behavior, since ethics originally refers to people's behavior. And there are lots of empirical sciences that address questions of people's behavior at a factual level. So the fact of how people actually behave. And so you can think of that questions of psychology, anthropology, sociology, economics. These are all interested in describing how people actually act. Normative ethics is interested in how people should act or ought to act. And each ethical theory gives some theoretical foundation or reasons for its vision of what ought to be the case. But normative ethics always tells us what we should do, what should be the case. It gives us norms, which means commands for action, norms for how things ought to be. And metaethics is, as its name suggests, really meta, and it has to do with the meaning of moral terms. So what is the definition of good? What is the definition of right or wrong or just? And how can sentences that use those words be true, since they're different from sentences like the cat is on the mat or the sky is blue, right? So metaethics is about definitions and about concepts. Normative ethics is about norms or rules for how we should act. And descriptive ethics is about descriptions. It's about how we actually act. So the third learning objective is understand the first ethical theory introduced, ethical egoism, and how it differs from psychological egoism. So the big difference here is that remember that psychology is one of the descriptive fields or scientific field. So psychological egoism is egoism as a descriptive statement of how people actually act. Psychological egoism states that people, as a matter of fact, are deeply motivated by their own self-interest, that we're all kind of deep down selfish, which means primarily self-interested, and that is just how we are. And whether or not you agree with that as a fact, that is sort of a statement that is how people actually are, even if it seems otherwise. By contrast, ethical egoism is an ethical theory about how people should act. And it doesn't necessarily claim that all people are selfish or self-interested, but that in moral terms, they should be. So even if a person is not, even if a person tries to be very altruistic and, is not particularly self-interested on their own, from the perspective of ethical egoism, they ought to be. So remember that ethical egoism, the word ethical, it's about being an ethical theory about what should be And psychological egoism is a description, a statement or hypothesis that all people are actually, as a matter of fact, egoistic or selfish. So the fourth learning objective, the basic phenomenon that Hume observed, we sometimes just call this the is-ought problem. And remember, this means that you can't, according to this way of looking at things, go from simple factual information to a moral judgment or statement, right? If I win $1 million, that isn't automatically a morally good thing. I can't just say, I have $1 million, now I'm happy, therefore my life is morally good. We would want some sort of definition or concept which shows us what good, what definition of good we're working with. So one can't go just from factual information to a moral judgment unless you have what we call a bridge premise, which is at least one premise in whatever argument is being made, in which the definition of one of the moral terms we're using is stipulated, such that we can go from talking about factual information to making a moral claim or judgment, since we have the criteria for making that judgment in our premise. So this factors into analyzing factual, conceptual application and moral components of ethical issues. So if you think about an ethical issue, just any sort of case or question that we've covered in class, we can break it up into different components, right? There are the factual components, the question of like what has really happened in the case, the factual details that we often get from news or from reports, things like that. Conceptual issues or conceptual aspects of these cases we cover have to do with definitions, right? Concepts are about the meanings of words, about definitions. So sometimes the definitions have to do with morality, right? Like in our moral theories. Our moral theories give us concepts for what is good and what is bad, but they don't always have to be, right? Any question about definitions is a conceptual issue. For instance, the question of how we define a car or what counts as renewable energy or things like that. So anything having to do with a question of definitions will be a conceptual issue. Application will be the question of whether those concepts we have actually apply to the case at hand or the particular fact we're talking about. So for instance, there's a difference between the definition of, say, what a bribe is legally or according to our conventions, and then there's the question of whether this or that financial transaction is a bribe, right? So the question of how we apply our concepts and whether they apply is an application issue, because you can have a clear idea of the concepts you're working with and yet not necessarily be sure whether they apply to the given thing you're looking at. And moral components, even though this might seem a little bit redundant, remember that moral components of the ethical issues are those issues in the case about what should be done, right? So morality is in this class is always about, norms about what should or ought to be the case according to good or rigorous reasons. But in general, moral also has to do with, whether or not something should be done, right? So those are four things that are always present in any case that often have to be resolved in order to make sense of and come to a decision or a judgment on a particular case. Sometimes you can't solve them all before you have to actually make a judgment or decision, but these are all operative in looking at various cases or issues and decisions. So we do not get a lot of time to talk about the Mary Midgley piece called Philosophical Plumbing. So let's run through it just a little bit in case you did not get a chance to look at it. I've kind of just paraphrased and condensed as much as possible, sort of the gist of this piece, in case, again, you did not get a chance to look at it. So basically, what Midgley says in this piece is that philosophy is like plumbing. And like plumbing, it's necessary or it's required for our society, and it's not optional, even though, of course, we tend to think that it is, because it just seems to be this, bougie major in university that isn't really good for anything, but that for some reason, people study, nerds at least. That's how we tends to look. But her argument is that even though this might be how it seems, philosophy actually is just as important as plumbing. And so she uses this analogy to explain why, right? Both plumbing and philosophy are both activities that come about, that arise because there are complex systems that are sort of undergird our society and make our lives possible. And yet we rarely notice them unless something goes wrong, right? So just like any um, city or living place requires, plumbing and infrastructure and things like that. Um, Usually at the same time, when this is running smoothly, we don't really take it for granted, right? We just use the water, flush the toilet. There's no issues unless something goes wrong, and then all of a sudden we find that we don't really know how this complex um, system of plumbing works. I mean, one of y'all, a civil engineer probably does, but I certainly don't, right? And so that's why we resort to specialists and to someone who's trained specifically for this job, namely a plumber, right? And people generally accept that we need plumbers and specialists like that, but again, are skeptical whether or not we really need someone who specializes in philosophy, and whether philosophy itself is really useful at all, right? So at the same time, Midgley goes on and continues that the equivalent of bad plumbing or having leaky plumbing or whatever in plumbing, the analog or the analogy in philosophy and in our thought, like the life of our minds, is having confused concepts, right? So we already talked about concepts in the learning objectives, having confused definitions, having sort of either confused or incoherent ideas about the way things are or should be. All of that, I mean, that is the problem, right? According to Midgley. And so even though having confused concepts um, doesn't, show the same way as having leaky pipes, right? It's not like just because you have bad ideas, they smell like backed up sewage or anything. But still, having distorted or confused concepts can distort and obstruct our thinking, which in turn can sour our lives and bring us a lot of difficulties. So, on one hand, philosophy as a subject matter tends to develop late in the history of civilization, which makes us feel like we don't really need it because we made it so far without having it yet, right? And yet, the reason why philosophy comes late and doesn't seem like it's as important is because it takes us a while to figure out. It can take a while for us to figure out in our experience that our concepts aren't really working or that they're causing problems. And so it's just easier to locate the problems with one's environment or attribute our unhappiness or confusion to various external factors than to look at oneself critically. So philosophy is about looking at oneself critically and finding the problems with one's way of thinking as a way of solving one's sort of life problems rather than just looking for external causes, right? Like certainly plumbers and in general engineers and those who do all that kind of stuff and practical stuff um, are good at solving lots of problems like of an external nature. But whenever the problems are with our way of thinking, we have to address them somewhat differently, right? So, however, even though we might get along without ever sort of critically evaluating our ideas of things and our concepts. Sometimes our thinking is so distorted and it causes so many problems in our lives that we have no choice but to try to make explicit and question the assumptions and presuppositions and the concepts that we've been working with. And it's this need that philosophy exists to satisfy. Philosophy exists to satisfy the need of readjusting our concepts. Not only the educated or erudite, meaning the super well learned, are capable of having intellectual insights. Philosophy is the specialized discipline and disciplined work of thoroughly articulating details and consequences. To be a great philosopher, and it's not as though there's been too many of those, but to be a good one requires a rare combination of both logical acumen and creative vision in trying to think through and modify these concepts and make our vision of the world and ourselves better. It's hard to keep these two things together, keeping together the logical rigor and the sort of intellectual rigor, but also the sort of open and creative vision. It's really hard to keep these two together, especially in professional philosophy. And in the cases whenever they become disconnected, of course, philosophers can become disconnected. And philosophy becomes the thing that we think of it now, namely this sort of weird thing that you can study for fun, but which, again, it doesn't really do anything. So, um, now, of course, she gives an example of a sort of warped concept that has done a lot of damage in our world, and it has to do primarily with individualism. But in broad strokes, the argument just is that it's philosophy's peculiar business to concentrate on the gaps between all our conceptual schemes and the relationship between the conceptual schemes we use, right? And so, I mean, even though it's not quite, might not have been quite clear, this paper is saying that just like we need plumbers for plumbing, we need philosophers to help us work and clean up our conceptual schemes, which are the systems of concepts that we use in our lives and that we're thinking with. So this direct quote from the paper, from her paper, you can think of as sort of the thesis of this paper. I am then using this parallel with plumbing to say that the patterns underlying our thought are much more powerful, more intricate, and more dangerous than we usually notice, and that they need constant attention, and that no one of them is a safe universal guide. And by them, she means conceptual schemas or models, basically. So, like plumbing, we have a complicated system of, or a complicated conceptual scheme that sort of is operating under the surface of our thinking and our lives. And kind of like plumbing, we only notice whenever it seems to go wrong. And when it goes wrong, we need a specialist to help us sift it out, right? That's basically the argument of this paper, the analogy between plumbers and philosophers. Okay, hopefully that was a little bit helpful. Now we move on to week 2. Again, the overview. Be able to explain the first fundamental canon of the NSPE Code of Ethics, which orders engineers to hold paramount public health, safety, and welfare, to determine when it applies and to know what they're obligated to do when it does. So again, for this, you'll refer to your NSPE code already. You should notice that this first fundamental canon does seem to dovetail a lot with utilitarianism, since it is about health, safety, and welfare, which is something that if we can't necessarily directly quantify, at least is more quantifiable than a lot of other things. So we connect this up with our teaching of utilitarianism. Understanding the theory of utilitarianism, remember that really there are only 2 types that we're really talking about, even though we call them slightly different things, right? There's act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. An act is the same thing as what Smart calls extreme utilitarianism. Rule is is what he calls restricted utilitarianism. And they have to do with whether they are applied to in each individual specific act or action, or whether we are trying to talk more generally about act types and whether we're trying to talk more generally about act types or more generally about not simply individual actions, but kinds of actions, right? Like situations. So whatever form of utilitarianism you're talking about, you have to specify, or it should be specified, whether one is dealing with actual or expected consequences. And although actual consequences are the most important throughout utilitarianism, because we are, as a form of consequentialism, we are primarily interested in consequences. Generally speaking, we can say that in act utilitarianism, um, we are interested in actual consequences. And for rule utilitarianism, or for restricted utilitarianism, we make a lot of use of expected consequences, since we're basing our judgments on the rules whose consequences we can only expect or predict, right? So, but you need to specify expected or actual consequences. These are kinds of consequences that can be considered, and generally speaking, both are relevant in some measure, not equally, but usually they're both at play. And as whenever you're talking about utilitarianism, you also need to specify how like the thing that's held to be most valuable, what like the thing which we could call utility, right? Whether it's pleasure, in which case it would be a form of hedonist utilitarianism, utilitarianism based on pleasure, or whether we're looking at it as basing it on satisfying people's preferences, or whether we think there may be some objective list of good things that it is, that it that whether there is some objective list of things which are conducive to our utility. All of these are just ways of interpreting and cashing out the meaning of utility, which is always the thing in utilitarianism that you're trying to optimize or maximize if possible. We've talked a little bit about the objections. It's different from ethical egoism in that even though both are consequentialist, egoism is, well, egoist, and utilitarianism is egalitarian in that your own happiness is not considered more important than other people's happiness. We're trying to get the best optimized aggregate happiness. And it's different from the cost-benefit analysis, because the cost-benefit analysis is just a sort of economical, mathematical tool for weighing costs and benefits. The further choice to make decisions based on those costs and benefits would be where we can decide whether someone is acting like ethically egoist or utilitarian. But cost-benefit analysis is not a moral theory. It's just an economic tool that one can use in making calculations which can lead to a moral decision or judgment, but not on its own. And ethical egoism and utilitarianism are moral theories about what we should do, how we should act or behave. Remember the case from your class time, the Ford Pinto case. Generally speaking, the case was used to, just as an example, since we had in that case the situation of the company having to make the calculation and using the cost-benefit analysis to make a decision about whether it was whether they were going to, repair or include the repairs on the cars. So you'll just want to think back to your notes on that one. Understand J.J. Smart's, these ideas from his piece, Extreme and Restricted Utilitarianism. Remember that extreme utilitarianism is act utilitarianism. Restricted utilitarianism is rule utilitarianism based on rules. Causal versus hypothetical universalization. Typically, an extreme utilitarian is only interested in causal universalization. The question of, again, the actual consequences of what would happen if we generalized an action or universalized an action. Whereas hypothetical universalization tends to be used more by rule or restricted utilitarians and is a question not about what will happen, but about what would happen in a world like that. So hence that's more hypothetical. And generally speaking, extreme utilitarians only use moral rules as rules of thumb. They are not independently binding on themselves. Every situation is different, and you would ideally make the utilitarian calculus in every single sort of decision and action. But that would also be really complicated and probably boring and tiresome. And so it's okay to use moral rules as rules of thumb, generally speaking. Again, for week 3, back to the NSVE. And here we remember that issuing public statements only in an objective and truthful manner seems to be most consistent or justified by Kantian duty ethics, which is why it makes sense for us to kind of teach it in this week. Kant's terminology, right? So remember, the will is a faculty of, the human mind that animates our action. Since, we are animate sort of beings that are able to make free choices. And from Kant's perspective, that comes about from having this faculty of desire or the ability to make choices and to act. So the will is the faculty of the mind that animates those decisions, and ultimately sort of drives us. Our will is expressed in our maxims, which are sort of subjective rules or laws that we give to ourselves that Kant thinks we act on anytime we're acting freely. So every time you act, you have an implicit maxim or intention that you can state to yourself. Now Kant thinks that our moral responsibility is to conform our will and so our maxims to this objective rational moral law that exists independently of us. And this moral law is called the categorical imperative or the unconditional command. And it's also called the categorical imperative because it technically applies to a category, the category of rational being. So although that sounds a little bit more complicated, and honestly, I hate that explanation, it's still one that you might be asked about. So remember that categorical imperative both means unconditional in the sense that, in contrast to a hypothetical imperative, it's not really negotiable. A categorical imperative is something you just have to do or follow. And it also is an imperative, which is binding upon the category of rational being. And since humans are rational beings, according to Kant, we fall under this, the purview of this moral obligation, right? Yeah, like I said, a hypothetical versus a categorical imperative is that one is based on your initial buy-in, right? Like if you want to do well as a student, you should, go to class, study, all of those things. But no one says you have to be a student, right? There's no rule that says this is what you have to choose. So whether you're following those imperatives, so to say, is hypothetically based on whether or not you want something out of it. But Kant doesn't think morality works that way. It is categorically binding on us, which means it doesn't matter what you want or are trying to do. You have to do what the moral law sort of commands of you. And it has 3 formulations, which we talked about a little bit, but remember generally that they are just we use them as tests, and so we call them tests, but they are their own formalizations, right? One is universalization, the question of sort of whether we can universalize, whether we can logically universalize our maxim or intentions without contradicting ourselves and thereby making an exception for ourselves. The second formulation is about humanity and not using humanity as a mere means to ends, including ourselves. And the third formulation is about autonomy, right? The idea that each of us is a rationally self-sufficient lawgiver for ourselves, and so should be able to recognize the moral law with our reason and not be coerced or oppressed by other people. Right, so universalizability, self-defeat, respect for persons. So clearly Kant's theory differs from egoism, and in general from all forms of consequentialism, in that he thinks that consequences are never what as such determines the right or wrongness of actions. Um, Precisely because we might say as well of the is-ought problem, right? Kant thinks that all of the sort of factual information about consequences doesn't really get to the question of what we ought to do or what ought to be. It's not consequentialist. It is egalitarian in the sense that utilitarianism is, at least in that all of us have a sort of equal standing before the moral law, and nobody is necessarily more important than any other. So in that way, it's different from egoism. Um, it's different from rule utilitarianism because although Kant's theory and rule utilitarianism make use of a kind of universalization, remember that rule utilitarians use the hypothetical universalization. That's precisely kind of what Kant is not interested in specifically. He is interested in whether we can logically universalize um, our intentions and not with what the consequences would be if everybody did something, or what they would be if everybody did something, XYZ, right? So in that sense they're different, and it's also the question of not using others as a mere means to an end, um and also sort of just not acting on inconsistent or ununiversalizable maxims is different from the intersubjective golden rule, because from Kant's perspective, the moral law is objective, and the golden rule is sort of actually depends on how you want other people to treat you, right? For Kant, the moral law, like you're following the moral law, isn't based on how I or who the other people necessarily feel or what they want, right? So whereas one is intersubjective, it's between people and kind of depends on what they want and how they want to be treated, even though it's reciprocal. That's different from the objectivity and the universalizability of Kant's formulations of the categorical imperative. Remember the Le City Court case and be able to analyze the case using all of the various theories. Remember, importantly, in a lot of these cases, like the facts of the case don't particularly change, but you just have to get into the habit of trying to think from the perspective of these moral theories to see, well, what would each various theory care about primarily in this case, and what would they see as right or wrong with it. We saw that even though the consequences of the Citicorp case were not actually bad, in that they were able to prevent a disaster from happening, as insofar as they were somewhat dishonest with the public about it, that's what, from a content perspective, would be seen as problematic, right? So that just goes to show you that there are different aspects of cases which different theories care more about. In Kant's case, it's a question of whether there was dishonesty involved. In the utilitarian case, of course, it's a question of what the actual consequences were, or what rules were followed, what hypothetical rules were followed that were conducive to utility. Patrick Lynn's article, the short one about, again, autonomous vehicles. Similarly, it's asking you something similar. Just be thinking through what possible things these theories could care about in terms of either consequences or fairness or autonomy. Each theory is going to be a little bit different on how they look at it. And there's not right answers to all of the ways you could think it through. You just have to know that, based on the principles of the theory, how we could begin looking at it and what conclusions we could reach or might reach. Okay, so the week 4 learning objectives. So understand, again, back to the NSPE, the second fundamental canon of the NSP Code of Ethics, and which says that engineers shall perform services only in areas of their competence. Again, there always seems to be some hook for the theory we are teaching in a given week. So here, keep in mind that engineers performing services only in the areas of competence seems to invoke an idea of either their technical or intellectual virtues, and the idea that there is some sort of competence that they can have in their field, which makes them exemplary or, good functioning members of their profession. So they'd be thinking about how virtue ethics generally might apply to engineering. Explain, of course, Aristotle's terms, right? So every creature, every sort of thing for Aristotle has a kind of telos, which is its aim or a goal in existing. With the famous example we use is, of course, the acorn and the tree. But in general, this idea that there is a potential in everything to become the fullest version of what it is, complete with all of the qualities that would make it, glorious. And whether or not it reaches that potential depends on a lot on circumstances and some other things, right? So that full potential that one reaches or that one can actualize, we call that eudaimonia or happiness for human beings like us, right? Presumably a knife can't be happy. For a knife to be virtuous, it would be different. But if it was conscious, we might think that it's being the best knife it can be, right? The century tree is not sentient as far as I can tell, but it's a really pretty, beautiful, oak tree that we've, preserved over the years. So we could probably say that the century tree is living its best life or manifesting its full potential, we might say, unlike a lot of the trees immediately around it. But for humans, the fullness of our potential is this actualization of eudaimonia, which really means flourishing, right? I mean, we've translated happiness, but it means sort of flourishing, being fortunate, having the circumstances come together in such a way that you're lastingly and enduringly, satisfyingly sort of full and happy or fulfilled, not just momentarily kind of feeling good, right? That's a big difference. For Aristotle, happiness is not it's not really about pleasure like it is for utilitarians. It's about a sort of lifelong project and kind of fulfillment and satisfaction, the fulfilling of one's potential. And when in the process of fulfilling one's potential and coming to be one's best self, one develops the arete or the arete, which are virtues, which are excellences that make any which was used to talk about how any specimen of a kind is an excellent specimen of that kind, right? Okay, so they contribute to the development of the good life. Again, the good life we could call eudaimonia. They're basically the same thing. And this is the realization of potential. In our case, our human potential. So understand the general arguments made in sections 1, 2, and 7 of Kraut's piece. So if you didn't get a chance to look at that, let's go through it really quickly. I'm just going to go ahead and read again this kind of summary or gist. These are, based on these sections. So roughly speaking, this is sort of Kraut's thing, right? The Greek word arete, the plural is arete, which meaning virtue or excellence, originally meant manliness or valor, right? Like the valor of soldiers and that kind of thing. However, by the time of Plato, which is still a long time ago, this word arete referred to the qualities that made someone or something good. Virtues relate to tasks and require performing the tasks well. Not only humans, but animals, artifacts, and organs can have virtues, that is, qualities that make them good. In Aristotle, the function of a good thing is to do something well, that is, according to the excellences of its kind. Humans have a distinct function for Aristotle, and our being good requires performing that function well as well. So being good for a human consists in virtuous activity, and Aristotle's book, the Nicomachean Ethics, which is where we get a lot of his virtue ethics theory from, might just as well be called Nicomachean character traits, since these qualities we're talking about are, virtues are also well described as character traits. So these virtues of character, there are virtues of character and virtues of thought, right? So two divisions of the kinds of virtues. The difference is based on the division between the parts of our soul that enables us to reason and the part that responds to reason, right? So in this ancient way of thinking, we have different parts of our soul, of ourself, and one part is, reasons, and another part sort of listens to reason. And, basically our mind and our emotions. And we're able to apply certain standards to our thinking or inferential activities, but part of our soul doesn't respond to reason at all, like our bodies. And so our bodies just sort of grow according to processes which we share with animals. And so besides thinking and growing, there are activities or processes which can would listen to reason, again, like our desires or emotions, right? So this is just a way of dividing up and saying that there are parts of ourselves that are able to reason and to apply standards to ourselves, and others which really aren't. And so a big part of virtue ethics for Aristotle will be getting these parts of our soul in the right order so that we're able to listen to reason and our, bodies and emotions are able to respond to reason. So being good for Aristotle means being in a good condition, both with regard to your thinking activities, right, to the life of your mind, in which case you have the virtues of thought, and being good in a good condition with regard to your desires and emotions and how they respond to reason. And in that case, you have the virtues of character, right? So the virtues of thought have to do with your thinking, or what we're calling here your inferential activities, the life of your mind, your ability to think, and the virtues of character have to do with managing your emotions or your passions, as we used to call them, and your desires. And you need both virtues of character and thought. Um, and the most important virtue of thought is what we call phronesis, or phronesis, or practical wisdom. And you need this practical wisdom in order to have other virtues of character like justice, courage, or moderation, which are the traditional virtues for the Greeks. And you need the virtues of character in order to have phronesis. So it's sort of like a mutually self-reinforcing thing. So the other important thing is that there are stages of development and growth in like ethical development for Aristotle, and these are the steps as they're outlined by Kraut. So first, we're born with the capacity to reason, but we can't exercise this capacity immediately, right? Just like we see, babies, even though they're born and they have the potential to eventually reason, it takes them a little while to get there. It takes time and learning to develop this capacity. And as for the virtues of character, a lot depends on our upbringing and wider community. But for childhood isn't entirely passive. Eventually, we start to be responsible for how our character develops. So even though as a kid, you're kind of at the mercy of your parents and whether or not which potentialities get cultivated in you for the first years of your life, that's kind of passive. But it doesn't have to be entirely passive. Eventually, as you grow, you become more and more responsible for how you yourself are developing. So even before we can take full control, children have the first inklings of character traits or natural virtues. Even a child can be brave, just, or moderate in their own way, for instance, like by sharing toys or coping with pain or being able to delay gratification. So these natural virtues are kind of, again, like the potential for developing into the full-fledged virtues that we need later, right? So on top of all this that we've been saying and the way we develop, we're also innately social. So under favorable conditions, children are more likely to share with and help others than be indifferent or hostile. But while a few people might be naturally blessed with a head start in being virtuous, most of us normal people will have to go the route of habituation and reflection, right? So the very word for habit, which in Greek is ethos, suggests that character traits, ethi, are formed through habitation, or rather habituation. So there's an element of repetition to it. We become just by doing just actions. We become courageous by doing courageous actions, and etc. But at the same time, this can't just be mindless repetition of an action. This is where we need the phronesis or practical wisdom. You have to be because you have to be able to recognize the situation in which the virtue would be called for, and in recognizing that it's the right situation, it's sort of like being able to use your practical wisdom to apply what virtue is called for. So, encountering many situations in which you have to decide what's just and how you'll develop um, is what is just is how you'll develop enough experience and insight about these matters, right? So experience, repetition, it has to at least be mindful in the sense that you're recognizing when the situations you're in. But by this habituation and repetition, we begin to develop, the virtues. So a child learning how to be virtuous also needs to develop the right affective responses to situations. So having the right emotions to meet the situations that you're in, right? Responding the right way emotionally to the situations you're in. So the example being, a child learning how to be virtuous has to enjoy treating others justly or be repelled by injustice. And that doesn't mean that active or rational thought is entirely dormant. Aristotle assumes that learning how to effectively respond to situations also requires developing problem-solving skills through experience. So in this way, reason also develops with the child. And there's not a hard line or a specific point after which we have finished acquiring the virtues. Like basically, just have to try to be good by acting well in all kinds of different situations that call for thoughtful and emotionally appropriate actions. You keep trying, and at some point, you qualify as a good human being. But in order to get there, you do have to get to a point marked by reasoning rather than simply by the habituation. And this involves discussion and teaching, right? So not only do you kind of have to effectively be raised right or have some good luck with how you're raised, but besides just habituating yourself to the right responses and the right actions in situations you find yourself in, this eventually since we're trying to get the child to be more responsive to reason over time, we require explicit discussion and teaching. And so, whereas the moral virtues or the virtues of character can only be acquired through experience and practice, the intellectual virtues can be conveyed often through teaching and discussion. Not always, but they're more conducive to teaching or being taught in an intellectual way than the virtues of character, which are about our passions and emotions. So experience is a prerequisite, but not the point of the teaching. Again, you have to have had some experience already, but this teaching can't give you experience. You have to go through a period of reflection in which you discuss what you've already learned and are good at, so the virtues you've developed through habituation. And in this way, the person who's developing, their ethical development eventually requires a philosophical component in which they reflect upon their experience in a systematic way. So Aristotle is like Socrates in this regard. Socrates thought that a good human being also had to be a good thinker, and this leads, to lead an examined life, we would say, right? And perhaps Socrates' mistake was to ignore all the preparatory training that would be required that precedes this philosophical reflection, but philosophy still plays a vital role in acquiring the virtues. And again, but even if you've developed good habits and become reflective, there's still no guarantee you'll turn out good. You could become even worse if you've reasoned badly. So there are three main factors to becoming good, according to this account that we've read by Kraut, right? There's nature, how we start off with our potentials and sort of what we're given to start with, the habits we form over time, and this reason, a component that sort of brings light to all of the sort of mindless habit or repetition that we needed to get started with. So a direct quote from the text is, one must have a soul that has a certain nature, then those natural qualities must be taken in the right direction by habituation, then those good habits must come under the guidance of reason. So it's possible reason could undo everything if you become convinced you should do otherwise. I mean, we can talk ourselves in and out of things a lot, right? But by the same token, if your life's going in a bad direction, then reason can help you decide that you need to reshape or reform yourself. Right, so that was another, just summary really quickly. And so, know the difference between aspirational, prohibitive, and preventative ethics. These are not different ethical theories, right? I know that we throw the word ethics around and we have stapled it to basically everything at this point, but importantly, these are just approaches to ethics. And they're more importantly, they tend to be approaches to professional ethics, right? Like so in professional ethics, including the NSPE code and the various codes you'll see in engineering, most of our codes of ethics tend to be prohibitive or preventive, right? They tell you what you're not allowed to do or what's prohibited, and the things that you are supposed to do are designed to prevent other bad things from happening or things being broken. The relationship that aspirational ethics has is that it's an approach to ethics, which is to say, what if we focus or we put a lot more emphasis not on just what we shouldn't be doing and what like we can get away with or not get away with, but rather what we can aspire to do. And so a kind of be your best self sort of approach to ethics rather than don't do this or don't do that, right? And in that way, aspirational ethics is more closely related to, or we can make sense of an aspirational approach to ethics through virtue ethics, so that virtue ethics seems to be more aspirational in character. It's about the virtues we want to cultivate and the people we want to become, and doesn't give us as much sort of red tape about specific actions the way Kantianism and utilitarianism do. So remember, aspirational, prohibitive, and preventive ethics, these are not distinct ethical theories. They are approaches to ethics, approaches to largely professional ethics, ways we can approach, ethics. And but aspirational ethics does seem to go along with virtue ethics a lot. So they're not the same thing, but they are related. Okay. Understand the argument presented in Miller's piece. So and connect those ideas to Elizabeth Hausler, who you guys talked about in class. Let's look through the piece really quickly. These are all direct quotes from the text, but they are selected in such a way that hopefully you can see the movement of the argument. So on page 92 of that piece, we get a kind of succinct statement of the thesis and outline of the paper that Dr. Miller gives us. He writes, I propose that the concept of identity can orient the combination of intellectual and moral aspects of professional ethics and provide a durable foundation on which its practitioners can make decisions far into the future. With this orientation, imparting knowledge about or historical and common cases encountered by professionals, unacceptable actions, and the importance of preventing immoral behavior, illegal actions, and harmful consequences remains an essential part of professional ethics development, but one that contributes to a larger goal. They provide a ground for and catalyze the development of each individual's identity. Professional ethics regains its aspirational and reflective character, making it more than dogmatic instruction. It is the challenge of crafting a meaningful life that appropriately forms and is formed by commitments and identifications. Seen in this way, the ultimate task of ethics is to develop an integral view of oneself, which includes professional and personal dimensions, that is robust enough to develop over time, that is aware of professional expectations, including technical and ethical practices, that is inclined toward continued growth, and that results in thoughtful action. I mean, that was a huge mouthful, right? But the idea of this paper is kind of like, we all know that there are issues with the way we teach professional ethics, and honestly, even probably ways with the way we teach this class, or rather with the ways that a class like this has to be taught, right? Like ideally, we would get you all and teach you philosophy and stuff, but I mean, nobody has time for that. You don't have time for that. So many times, ethics education, professional ethics education becomes a list of regulations, prohibitions, and a lot of information which you can sort of parrot and get people to copy and paste and sort of memorize and regurgitate. But it can be really hard to just ask, like, how do we make ethics education actually add up and contribute towards, for instance, y'all engineers actually turning out to be good people, right? It's really hard. But Dr. Miller is arguing that something about this forming identity or conceiving of teaching ethics or professional ethics with an eye towards um, the concept of identity, sort of grounding all of the various things that we teach or that are thrown at you in professional ethics, that this sense of identity that can be developed will be stable enough to sort of ground people after the class they take. And basically, like I'm saying, basically the idea that of the concept of identity and using or kind of trying to shape teaching professional ethics in a way that helps you form a sense of identity will be a better way of helping those who take professional ethics courses, like y'all engineering students, to retain and to integrate what you learn and to really make that part of who you are, rather than simply a list of information that you have to memorize and get through to pass the class. So that focus on identity goes on, and the paper has three remaining parts, right? So the first is, Dr. Miller just tells us for, a couple of important reasons that virtue ethics is a better model for thinking about ethics and the way we teach it to engineers and well, yeah, mainly to engineers, right? To professionals in STEM fields. Precisely because whereas Kantianism and utilitarianism and a lot of that stuff seems to hyper focus on individual actions in like these highly hypothetical cases, like the trolley experiment, or I mean, the trolley problem. Real life, especially for like a lot of professionals like y'all and people who are going to be working on teams and things like that, within companies and corporations, like it's not like a lot of that stuff is not immediately applicable, right? And we still have to think about the relationship between an agent and the acts that they do and the goals and the ends that they're acting for. And in general, without going into all the details, you can read that section of the paper if you'd like. Generally speaking, Dr. Miller just thinks, yes, we should approach this like virtue from the perspective of virtue ethics. That gives us a more integrated version of understanding a person and what they do and how they act ethically, than just treating ethics primarily about decision making or individual decision making procedures, right? So from then, we get to the second section of the paper where, at the same time, even though we want to take this virtue ethics approach to engineering or teaching engineering ethics, um, people like Aristotle were concerned with ethics as such for like humans in general, right? There's not a lot of leeway for parts of our life that, we live in a much more specialized society now where we're not all just kind of doing the same thing. And so based on that, Dr. Miller takes some ideas from Alistair MacIntyre, his idea of practice, and from Charles Taylor's idea of moral spaces. And the important thing is that taking these two ideas, he gets the idea of ethical fields. And this is his definition. Ethical fields are spaces with moral, social, and physical dimensions that individuals can elect to enter, where particular dispositions and actions, determined by the goals of the practice, are held and exercised, respectively. In contrast to Aristotelian virtues that are desirable for all humans by virtue of their animating soul, such as prudence and justice, certain virtues are more important in some fields than others, right? And that's the important takeaway, that by thinking about the idea of what a practice is, as well as what a moral space is, we get this idea that there may be fields, specific fields, indeed fields within engineering or professional ethics, where some virtues are more important for others. And so that's how we can get to talking about what would make some specifically virtuous engineer of a specific type, rather than just what would make a virtuous person. So again, within each ethical field, characteristic virtues can be identified. They are usually widely held by agents in the field and contribute to its successful navigation. These virtues can arise naturally based on appropriateness to practices of the field, or through convention based on social agreement and consensus. And again, so that's, I guess, another conceivable difference between Aristotle's account and this idea that, again, whereas Aristotle looks at what the virtues are required for a virtuous human in general, once we have this idea of specific ethical fields, then within those fields, there are characteristic virtues, and those will be based on what's best for that field, right? All right, so, and once we have identified, and of course, since it's specific to field, acquiring those virtues is also going to be important and social. It'll be really good and important to have like mentors and professional and personal relationships that help you develop those virtues. So in that way, that it's also still an important part of the Aristotle stuff we've been talking about, like having models and exemplars who you can admire and look up to and imitate. All of that's will be important in this sort of professional ethical field or special ethical field of engineering. Yeah. So then the third section, having sort of gotten to that point, is this idea of identity and self-authorship. So in this case, identity is formed whenever people answer what are called qualitative questions, right? And these are also come from Charles Taylor. And the sort of, what is a qualitative question, right? Qualitative questions include questions about how I'm going to live my life, with which touch on the issue of what kind of life is worth living, what kind of life would fulfill the promise implicit in my particular talents, or the demands incumbent on someone with my endowment, or of what constitutes a rich, meaningful life, as against one concerned with secondary matters or trivia. So basically, the idea, these qualitative questions are the big important questions we have to ask about ourselves, right? Like, what kind of life is worth living? What kind of life do I want to lead? What does it mean? Like, what matters to me? What really, like, what should I do with my life? These are qualitative questions, which when we answer them, according to Miller, an individual answers these questions in word, either in conversation or in mental deliberation, and in act in the practices and virtues they have sought and choose to seek. The process of answering these questions can be thought of as writing one's autobiography, a unique story that consists of one's selection of the ethical fields he or she chooses to inhabit, what is said and done in each, and how they'll be integrated, right? So put simply, answering these questions is the task of determining one's ultimate good, the target at which an individual aims, which determines one's identity. Right? So it becomes really important that in the process of having to answer these qualitative questions, you wind up writing your own life story, and as well as articulating your identity and your commitments in a way that sort of shows who you really are. So, and this is something which, is important for us to do. So, and there's different ways of doing that. I mean, basically, quick summary of that section, right? There's just literature that indicates that having information or knowing what you're supposed to do, or having basically ethics education in which you've propositionally been told, what's right and wrong. And like basically having the information is not necessarily intrinsically motivating. Lots of people know what they're supposed to do, but don't do it, right? Or what they're not supposed to do and do it anyway. And so the literature seems to indicate, here we're talking about some social psychology literature, seems to indicate that having a strong sense of identity, which includes the ability to articulate one's sort of commitments as well as one's sort of sense of who they are and their sense of belonging, is a more stable foundation and is better for helping us figure out how we're going to act in difficult circumstances than what the classes we've taken or the information we have, right? So this quote, going on this quote then, articulation of one's identity, an intuitive sense of the right decision, proper dispositions, and attention to one's virtues and vices yield a foundation needed for reasoned innovation, the form of self-authorship whereby the individual most clearly distinguishes his or herself. At this point, the agent can leverage his or her specific strengths toward a particular end, consciously step outside of generally accepted norms in a field and reconsider its characteristic virtues, and even work to alter practices of the profession. To put it another way, it is at this point that the professional can engage his or her imagination, practical and moral, to act freely. A professional acting this way with capabilities appropriately developed has informed freedom. Professional ethics programs should be designed to make this end a possibility. So basically, we can see that the summary of this article is that we should be teaching professional ethics, like engineering ethics, with a view to helping you develop a sense of identity, not only by helping you understand what ethical field you kind of belong to and what characteristic virtues are most important in those fields and that kind of thing, but also um, that ultimately, if you are able to do this, to develop these virtues and to find your place in your sense of self and identity, you will ultimately have this kind of informed freedom, which is so ideal and important in Aristotle as well as our sort of general Western ways of thinking. So yeah, the idea is we should think more about helping y'all form a sense of identity based on your ethical commitments and obligations, rather than just crapping information onto you and expecting you to regurgitate it on a test. Um, this is just a quick reminder that in thinking through the ethical theories, I know it'll feel like there's a lot of stuff you have to memorize that is just a lot. Think in broad strokes. You want to think about in terms of the theories, right? All we've covered are 5 theories in this class so far. They're all pretty distinctive, right? Egoism, rule utilitarianism, act utilitarianism, Kantian duty ethics, and virtue ethics. So you remember what justifies actions, what makes right actions right for each theory. Just a really quick summary. One is for egoism, one is justified in an action or a decision if and only if that action or decision is in one's best interest. Otherwise, it would be unjustified. Act utilitarians, one is justified if that individual action optimizes utility. And for that, of course, you need to stipulate a metric. For the most parties affected, and it would be unjustified otherwise. For rule utilitarianism, one is justified in an action or decision if that type of action falls under or follows a stipulated rule, which, if generally followed, would optimize utility by a stipulated metric for most parties affected. But the problem with this is that exceptions wind up being tricky. For Kantian duty ethics, or for deontology, as we also call it, one is justified in an action if the maxim behind that action can pass the formulations of the categorical imperative without, basically falling afoul of any of them, right? Without showing a contradiction or self-defeat, without using others or oneself as a mere means to some end, without violating one's or others' autonomy, and it would be unjustified. We would show that that maxim would be wrong and that we shouldn't act on it if it did run up against one of those problems. Virtue ethics, one is justified in an action if that is the kind of action which a virtuous or exemplary person would perform in a relevantly similar situation. Or another way of saying this is that one is justified in an action decision in virtue ethics if that action instantiates the virtue or the excellence most relevant to the situation at hand, right? So you're in a situation that calls for patience. Being patient is the thing that a virtuous person in that situation would do. Then you ought to be patient, right? Being patient for you would be virtuous. All right, so that was a lot. Probably not enough, but anyway, I hope this helps. Let me know if you need anything. Gigum.